Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Gina Smarecki. I'm the events manager here at Newsfire, and I'll be your host for this live session. So today's webinar is always popular because we look at Newsfire's threat findings from last quarter, and also we review last full year for 2022. We're really excited to share this research and our insights on the current trends in cybercrime. The full threat landscape report is available now, was published earlier this morning, and I'll go ahead and share that link in the chat box for you in case you'd like to take a look. For a bit of fun and in the spirit of giving back, we will be giving away a couple gift cards to 5 lucky registrants from today's webinar. Winners can enjoy a gift on us while we support the Make-A-Wish charity. So make sure you watch your emails. I'll be notifying the winners in the coming days. If you have questions during the presentation, please throw them into the Q&A tab on the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to address them as they come up and or at the Q&A session at the end. We do have a lot of content to cover today, so we're going to move fairly quickly through the slides to try to leave a couple minutes at the end for questions. But there is a different tab for the chat. If you want to go ahead and use the chat tab and let us know where you're joining in from today, we'd love to see you. And then just so you know, everyone will receive a follow-up email with a link to watch the recording of the session later on. So at this time, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our speakers today, Josh Smith and Justin Hurd. Josh is a cyber threat analyst at Newsfire who works closely in organizational threat landscapes, curating threat intelligence, and authoring Newsfire's quarterly threat landscape report. Josh is currently pursuing his master's degree in cybersecurity technology. He previously served with the U.S. Navy as an operations specialist with 14 years of service. Josh has been quoted in Forbes, CSO Online, Channel Futures, Dark Reading, and many others. Justin is our manager of threat intelligence and works to develop and deliver intelligence at Newsfire. He has over 13 years of experience in the cybersecurity industry and has developed methodologies and tools for industry-based threat modeling. Justin previously worked 6 years for a defense contractor as a security engineer and network administrator. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Josh and Justin to dig right in.
All right, thank you all very much from wherever you're joining for. We have a lot of content to get through today, so we're going to kind of buzz through some of this stuff quickly. As Gina mentioned, we will be taking questions, so feel free to put those in there. We'll jump on those at the very end of the presentation. And if we don't get to everybody's questions, we will go ahead and do our best to email you back answers. So what we're trying to cover here today is we'll go over our methodology and our overview. We're going to take a look at all of our different data sets, which we have 3 specific ones we're going to break down: our malware section, our botnet section, and our exploit section. At the end of each one of those, we'll also have remediation and mitigation procedures you can do. After that, we'll wrap it all up with some conclusions and recommendations.
Hello, thank you everyone for joining. Thanks for the introduction, Gina. This talks a little bit about the methodology that we use in the threat intelligence team to kind of gather and process this data. We start with the gathering process, which is using all the data that we have from our security systems, pulling that together, processing it, formatting it in a way that is normalized so we can actually get some good numbers out of it. And then we go into detect. This is where we're actually using a lot of this information and other information that we collect in order to build detections around things. We'll evaluate all of that intelligence. We'll evaluate the, if the intelligence is actually working or the detection's working, and then ultimately disseminate that data. And so that can be through strategic or tactical intelligence. And this is a perfect example of us disseminating some of our intelligence today.
So as we jump right into our first section, which is the malware section, we had just shy of 2.5 million detections throughout Q4. This was a negative 34% decrease when we compare these numbers specifically against Q3. We did detect over 500 unique variants. So when we look at our top 5 malware specifically for Q4, CoinMiner in Q3 was our top leading malware that we detected. That activity from CoinMiner started to decrease, and in doing so, allowed malicious Excel files with initial loaders to kind of take over that spot. Another thing we've seen creeping up here recently is malicious JavaScript files, which we're going to jump into both of those things here in just the next couple slides. As we look at the Microsoft Excel variants, in late 2022, Microsoft came out and by default blocked Visual Basic for Applications macros. So a lot of those macro banners you'd see when you open up an Excel file that would say, hey, to enable macros, click this button. A lot of those were being used very maliciously by threat actors, and Microsoft recognized this. So they went ahead and blocked these by default. It's much more difficult now to be able to enable one of those. So after that happened, we started to see a decrease of these variants in Q3. Come Q4, we've started to see Excel variants start to pick back up again. And specifically what they're using is a lot of .xll files, which is a type of dynamic link library. Excel can execute those. And this really isn't a new tactic per se, is it's something that's being circled back to. Initially back as far as 2017, APT10 or Stone Panda, as they're also known as, they really heavily use this tactic in phishing campaigns to get initial loading in. So still keep your guard up around Microsoft Excel files and really Office files in general. Some of the stuff that we're seeing right now in Q1 that we'll likely be able to talk about in our next webinar is a lot of campaigns being launched specifically using OneNote documents. We've released a threat brief here just recently from our team that talked about some of the analysis that we did on that. We look at JavaScript and phishing variants from that. As I mentioned, we did see a steady increase of these throughout Q4. A lot of this could be possibly attributed to the fact that Excel took that hit with blocking those VBA agents. JavaScript variants have come and gone, but again, with the new emphasis on not being able to use Excel as much as they did, I believe that's why we're starting to see a big increase in it again. A lot of these came through as HTML attachments. Once a user would execute those, it would contain JavaScript files to redirect the user to different phishing forms or malicious websites. So consider also blocking HTML attachments within your environment if that's not something that's typically emailed around. As we look at the full year of 2022, overall, when we compare 2021's numbers to 2022's numbers, we did still see a 6.85% increase in malware activity as a whole. As we saw in late April, after Microsoft made an announcement initially stating that they were going to block the agents, it wasn't really in place just yet, but we did start to see a decline, likely as threat actors were reacting to that news and beginning to adjust their tactics. There's one thing that we've learned in general is threat actors love phishing because of how easy it is to deploy it. And if you remove one vector, as far as like the VBA agents, they're going to find a new way to do it. It's just something they can broadly send out and spread to numerous people. And all they need is one user to interact with it and bite it to be able to possibly get access into a network. We look at the top variants for 2022 as well. Phishing payloads, as I was just mentioned on the previous slide, remain to be one of the top variants that we witnessed across everything. With that also being said, the other non-phishing variant that we saw significant amounts of were coin miners. These coin miners are the cryptocurrency coin miners that, if installed maliciously on your machine, they sit dormant quietly. They don't want to be detected and use up that system's resources to passively gain income for these different threat actors. I believe that's one of the reasons why they're so popular, is if they can spread them out to a bunch of different devices, just passive income. They can sit back and just collect cryptocurrency and be able to cash that out for whatever their needs. And I'll shift it over here to the mitigation and response for malware.
Thank you, Josh. And so, all those things beg the question, what can we do about it? And so here's some malware mitigation and response techniques that we use and we recommend that you use as well. Endpoint protection platforms. This is actually kind of helping us in a way of detecting the techniques that are used for these attacks. So phishing, we talked about phishing as initial access. The technique could be some type of dropper or command and control. The endpoint protection platform gives us some telemetry data to look into to try to detect some of these things. Network segregation, having a healthy, clean network where all of the entities within inside that network only have access to the things that they need, in that, finance is in its section, and then you have maybe operations in this section, and then only allowing traffic back and forth between the entities that need to communicate. And then the last one here is probably one of the most effective, but sometimes overlooked, the cybersecurity awareness training. As Josh mentioned, phishing is a huge vector for initial access, and it'll continue to be used. And we've seen it continue to be used through this year, or through last year, and then into this year as well. So cybersecurity awareness training, teach your users what they should be opening. If they have questions, send it over. Have a process for them to be able to send it over to someone to analyze it for them, and just kind of build that response chain when they start looking at emails.
We move over into our botnet section now. What we see here is just shy of 1 million detections throughout Q4. With that also, there was a negative 66% decrease when we compare against Q3. And with that, that's still 30 unique botnets that we did detect during Q4. With the top 5 botnets that we witnessed, Torpig MeBrute, which is a banking botnet, continues to be one of the highest witnessed during Q4. We did see a significant decrease in activity with Torpig, though, as compared against Q3, which did contribute to that large drop in activity that we witnessed. So Torpig, as I just said, was one of our most active within Q4, but it by itself had a 60% drop in activity. That drop in activity, and for basically how much of the activity witnessed belonged to that group, caused that huge drop that we saw this quarter. Even with that drop, this still was the most prevalent witnessed botnet that we had. So Torpig is coming to go in waves that we've seen all throughout 2021 and 2022. But when it does infect, it can be very, very difficult to remove. It's a rootkit that infects the master boot record of victim devices. This group is very focused financially. And so what they're looking to do once they infect a device is to steal payment information, credentials, and harvest things really that are saved out of users' browsers as well. So anytime someone's saving all those different passwords, credentials, things like that within their browser, it's one of the things they're looking to scrape out of there to be able to resell or use themselves. The Andromeda Botnet is one of the older botnets that's still active today. It's often utilized by other malware groups to basically get initial access. So once Andromeda infects, and it can spread, it's formable throughout a network. They can then reach out and have ransomware operators or info stealers piggyback off that initial connection that they've made and basically make some extra money that way. It was also seen utilized during 2022, specifically by Russian-sponsored advanced persistent threat groups, just prior to the invasion of Ukraine. About a month prior, malware infected USB sticks with the Andromeda botnet were distributed throughout the country, basically just to see where they'd get plugged into and if it was something that would be strategic to them. As we look at the 2022 year as a whole, we did still see a 32% increase in total activity as we compared to the previous year. A lot of that activity came specifically from things such as Torpig and from Andromeda. Those two alone captured over 50% of witnessed activity within 2022.
And so a little bit on botnet mitigation and response. Ultimately, botnet is a tool. It's a tool that the threat actors are using in order to do something else. Josh talked about collecting cache information in your browser. They can use it to drop other payloads, gather information about your machine or your network. This is one of the areas where we use threat intelligence a lot. There's sources out there where you can collect the IP addresses, domains, URLs that these botnets use and detect those when you see them inside of your network. Also understanding the different threat actors that are using those botnets, what their motivations are, is something that is collected through threat intelligence as well. And we can use that to better protect our clients and our devices. Next generation firewall, a lot of signatures. They also have some of these lists built into the firewall to detect and block some of that communication. So a next generation antivirus and firewall is a way to block that. And then the last one here is threat hunting. And that kind of goes back to the threat intelligence piece, where we're collecting intelligence about motivations, techniques, what they might be dropping, and then using our threat hunting team to hunt through our data currently and retroactively to figure out if we see any of these types of indicators inside of our network.
We move on to our last section, which is the exploit section. We saw a massive amount of activity towards the end of the quarter. I'm sure you can see there that big spike on the graph. And where this came from specifically was some newly launched campaigns that were brute forcing against Internet of Things devices, specifically camera systems. This brute forcing caused so much noise in this particular quarter that on our next couple slides where we talk about our top 5 and things of that nature, we really had to kind of exclude that information to be able to see just from the amount of activity that was witnessed. So when we do exclude and take a look at what these look like, Apache Log4j still remains one of the most popular exploit attempts. Came out about a year ago, and very critical and very powerful vulnerability if exploited. Because of that, threat actors are still out there searching for all those different types of devices that may still be exposed, utilizing popular tools, things like Shodan, for example. And if you're not familiar with Shodan, it's basically a Google search for exposed devices out there in the world. They can very easily go through there, search for the types of vulnerable systems that they're looking for and those version numbers, and get a whole list of devices that they can just go work through at that point and attempt to exploit them. So as we talk about the camera systems in the exploitation brute forcing attempts that we saw against those, this was one of the types of camera systems that we witnessed that synced up pretty closely with that big spike in activity. The vulnerability here isn't brute forcing that we're looking at specifically, but it's an older vulnerability that came out in 2021 that was critically rated against this particular camera system. And if it was exploited, would give a threat actor access to that camera as initial points within the network. There's really been a lot of focus, it seems like, at the end of Q4 from these threat actors on exposed camera systems. And it makes sense. A lot of times these IoT devices get plugged in. The firmware never gets updated on them. Sometimes folks leave generic passwords on them, which likely is where we're seeing the brute forcing attempts, is they're probably trying to smash in with dictionaries of all of these generic passwords and just real common weak passwords. And they can just do that against all of these exposed devices out there and see what they get lucky with. And then once they're in there, they can begin to fish out and search around for other exposed vulnerabilities and see where they can laterally move throughout the network. Another exploit that we saw some activity start to build up through was there was 2 specific 0 days that were announced in October of 2022 by Microsoft. When the vulnerabilities were first announced, there were no patches for these initially, and threat actors almost immediately pounced on it. Things like Exchange servers are very high value targets for threat actors. Gets them into the network, and they also have access to all the mail. And from there, they can really kind of get a good idea of what's happening within an organization and really be able to craft some different spear phishing and things of that nature, or piggyback on existing old conversations to be able to distribute additional malware throughout a network. It's pretty nasty if they can get a hold of one of those. So administrators and security folks within organizations definitely need to monitor if you have an on-premises Exchange server. Anytime any of these security advisories are announced, and be ready to act on those immediately as soon as the patches are available. So when we compare 2021 against 2022, ultimately we did see a 92% increase in exploit activity. And if it really drives home again just how big this brute forcing campaign was that we witnessed, that graph should speak for itself. So we saw a 92% increase year over year. A lot of that attributed to what just happened here within Q4 within the exploits. So it'll be very interesting as we move into Q1 of 2023 to see, does this activity continue? Was this just kind of a one and done campaign, or if IoT really kind of becomes the flavor of where these threat actors decide to target? So with all that looked at as well, if we exclude brute forcing activity again, because it would just dwarf on this pie chart here, Double pulsar was surprising to me as one of the most witnessed exploits. And the reason why I say that that's surprising is because this is a pretty old exploit. It came out in 2017, although it is very, very popular. This is the one that was created by the shadow brokers and suspected NSA. And if you can find an unpatched system using SMB with it, it's very, very powerful. You can get full control of a system. So with that, it's interesting and also something to keep in mind that threat actors will also attempt to still go back to old powerful exploits and attempt to maybe find systems out there that for some reason have still not been patched since 2017, or maybe somebody uses a new image, or I'm sorry, I should say an older image to spin up a new system and things just haven't been updated yet. And then as mentioned earlier too, Apache Log4j was very popular and continued to dominate throughout the year as well. And turn this over to Justin for wrapping up our review.
Yep. So exploit mitigation and response. It's interesting to see these remote code execution vulnerabilities are so dangerous. You know, like Josh was saying, you can go on Shodan, you can search for all of these, you know, all these systems that are vulnerable to these exploits and just start exploiting. And a lot of times this is just code. You know, they say, hey, go look at this. All these are vulnerable, try to run this exploit against it. And so the very first thing that we can do here is to patch our systems as soon as possible. Don't give them a chance to scan and find your machine and start to try to exploit it. And we see this so much. A lot of times patches come out for some of these security vulnerabilities and just, you know, it's hard to manage vulnerabilities. It's not an easy task, but it is so important to not be the path of least resistance when it comes to vulnerabilities. You want to have, you know, some layered security, and you want to have your system patched as fast as possible, and you know, before everyone else, to some extent. Use a firewall with IPS. It's just another layer to get through when it comes to exploiting vulnerabilities on your systems. Having those IoT devices that Josh is talking about behind a firewall or behind some type of security appliance, it just gives you that extra layer of security against those old IoT devices with old firmware on them. Monitor security news and vendor security bulletins. This is very big. That's where the information comes to let you know that you need to patch. Usually you'll see them in there before they start hitting mainstream media. Once they hit mainstream media, we have to assume that the attackers already have it in their hands, and they're going to quickly start developing things to start exploiting it. And then the last one here is disabling unused services, and just you know, network hygiene, making sure that things are open that don't need to be open, and then monitoring things that are open so you know if attempts are being made to exploit those devices or ports. Yeah, and one thing I want to add on here real quick about the patching your systems too. That's something that we just saw in the recent news cycle with some of the VMware exploits. Made big news about a big campaign of attacks in France. That was a year-old exploit that had come out. So the patch had been out for almost a year at that point. And literally what the threat actors did was they went to Shodan, found a list of exposed services that were still vulnerable, and began working their way down the list and begin to exploit them. It's very, very important to, again, know what you have, what your digital footprint is, what's exposed, and prioritize patching that outer perimeter to ensure that you're not the weakest target out there, so to speak. Generally, unless you've drawn the ire of a threat actor for some reason, they're financially driven and they're looking for the lowest hanging, easiest fruit. As Justin said, the path of least resistance. So in conclusion here with the recommendations, you know, if we're taking a step-by-step approach to what we need to cover here, we need to educate all our users and educate them often, especially around phishing, the types of attacks they may witness within their work environment. Layered security, that's having, you know, multiple layers of security when it comes to, you know, maybe a firewall, web application firewall, EDR, antivirus, on your systems, just having that layered approach, patching your tech stack, having some sort of vulnerability management within inside of your organization to understand things that are vulnerable, and then watching those bulletins and keeping up to date on when new patches come out for those vulnerabilities. Update your malware protection. It's very easy to let these things start to kind of get out of date. Making sure that they're working as expected, everyone has it installed, it's updated, and all that good stuff. The last one here is segregate higher risk devices. Identify the devices that are the most important to your operations, that would have the most impact to your organization if something were to happen to them, and protect them behind as many layers as you possibly can, and then ultimately make sure that they're patched against new exploits.
And with that, that wraps up mine and Justin's section of this, and we'll turn this back over to Gina.
Awesome. Thanks to both of you for a great discussion there and sharing all of that data. So we do have a couple of minutes left for questions. We'll take in just a second here. But at this time, I would like to quickly mention our next webinar next month on March 16th, where we will have our VP of Security Operations on, who is going to break down what it takes to build a successful in-house SOC, or Security Operations Center. So I'll go ahead and share the link to that real quick in case anyone on the line is interested. And again, a reminder, the full threat report that we went through some highlights on today's webinar is available on our website. It's in the chat at the very top from the beginning. So that is there. And let's take questions if anyone has.
See one question here from Jason, it looks like.
Okay.
And forgive me, I'm going to drag this chat box over so I don't have my neck twisted. There we go. The spikes in exploits is shocking, but I understand there was one exploit in particular, the brute force of cameras, that contributed to the stat. Do you see similar spikes in successful data exfiltration or other indicators of that initial IoT footholds had significant impact? Fortunately, I can say I am involved a lot at times with the incident responses we have here as well too, and also just in general about things that I've seen within the open media. Fortunately, a lot of what we're seeing here when we see the detections, that's blocked activity. So I've not personally seen much of a success per se of the IoT device being exploited, which then leads into something like a successful ransomware attack. But that doesn't mean that they're not trying. And if your network isn't segregated, that they couldn't break through and get to somewhere else with that kind of activity. They're trying that specifically against these cameras and stuff because it's low-hanging fruit per se, where again, they typically get plugged in, nobody pays attention to them ever again, and they don't get firmware updates when these known vulnerabilities come out. They're just easy targets per se. And so I think that we've just seen a really big shift is even back with the VBA agents and phishing, that's become much more difficult. That was a very, very prevalent tactic for these threat actors. And as they've lost this tactic, I think they're poking around trying to find new things that stick. And it wasn't too far after we started seeing a lot of the VBA agent stuff, which affected their Word and Mac or Excel macros, that we started seeing these other kinds of things start to lift up, like the JavaScript, this kind of brute forcing activity against the cameras. And I'm very much looking forward to the end of Q1 to being able to get a full picture of the data for the quarter to see what this fully looked like and to be able to maybe do some attribution about where some of these attacks are coming from.
All right, and I see one more question that came through. Any thoughts on how Newspire might help ease the challenge that is third-party risk management?
I can speak a little bit to that as well. I can't say that we have a particular service per se that assists with third-party risk management, but it is something that is definitely on the minds of clients as well as the general public as well too. And what I would say for that is making sure that you are monitoring one, the news for any form of a breach that may involve one of your third-party risks. Two, if you have some form of a vendor relationship with those folks, I think it's important for them to be held accountable to be able to tell you What is their cybersecurity policies? What do they do to keep your data that you've given to them safe? What kind of processes do they have if they were to face an incident? And I think that those organizations are responsible, if they have access to your network or your data, to be able to tell you how they protect your stuff. And if the answer isn't something that's satisfactory to you, whether that's finding another vendor that offers a similar service or ensuring you work with them to make sure it becomes an answer that is acceptable to you. That's how personally I would look at kind of starting a third-party risk conversation.
All right, thank you, Josh. And I don't see any other questions. So thank you, JP and Jason, for submitting those questions today. At this time, if there's no other questions, we're going to close it up. Any closing thoughts from either of you, Josh or Justin?
Ultimately, no. Thank you again very, very much, everyone who showed up today. I really hope we see you again come our Q1. And again, I think it'll be very interesting to dig into a lot more of this brute forcing stuff as we get a better picture of everything that's going on. I think it'll be an exciting one to kind of see where things go.
Yeah, for me, just thank you everyone for joining. It's very exciting for us to be able to share some of this information and provide the insight of what the information that we're gathering and how we can mitigate and respond to these types of threats. So it's always great to meet with you guys. Thank you for joining.
And if anyone does come up with any other questions, you can go ahead and email us at webinars@newspire.com. I can make sure that we get that to the correct department, or contact us through our website at newspire.com. And on behalf of Newspire and our presenters, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.